Hello, I'm Peter Tufano, Dean of the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Welcome to the latest in a series of events and conversations called Leadership in Extraordinary Times. The series has two elements: hearing from our world-leading academics who can help us understand what's going on and how to deal with this set of health, economic, and humanitarian crises, and also hearing from leaders at the front, women and men in positions of leadership during this time, this extraordinary time. At Oxford Saïd, we've always been attuned to the rules of the game, that set of written and unwritten rules and laws and norms that define the landscape within which business operates. Just in my professional lifetime, these rules have shifted dramatically, and the relationship between business and government in different parts of the world is, in fact, dramatically unlike. One of the implications of COVID-19 for many countries is a dramatic investment by governments to prop up businesses, making government, in effect, the biggest investor in many businesses today. How do we see the boundaries between business and government evolving in the immediate wake of this health and economic crisis, and over a much longer term? Today, we travel to Washington, D.C. to hear from one of the world's experts in the interface between business and government. Introducing our guest today and moderating the discussion is my Oxford Saïd colleague, Professor Mari Sako, who heads our International Business Group. Mari's expertise includes global strategy, comparative institutional analysis, outsourcing and offshoring, and professional services. You're in for a wonderful afternoon with Michael and Mari. Over to you, Mari. Thank you both.
Thank you, Peter. So I think the idea that in times of crisis, some things are too important to be left to markets is not new. But compared with the last crisis, which I think all of us would think of as the financial crisis in 2008-09, the current pandemic crisis has really brought to question many more assumptions that we take for granted, including the respective role of government and business. To address that issue, today I'm very honored to be joined by an expert who is very well positioned to address this issue, not least because of his experience in having worked in public policy, business, and also capital allocation as well. So I'd like to introduce Michael Warren, who is currently Global Managing Director of ASG, which is Albright Stonebridge Group. In public policy, Michael had worked in the White House and Labor Department under the Clinton administration, and more recently in the Obama administration, having acted as a member of the board for the US government's Development Finance Institution, OPIC. Also, in private sector, he's on the board of a number of different companies and institutional investors, including Washington, D.C.'s public pension fund. So with that range of expertise, we're going to engage Michael in a conversation around the respective role of government and business and the possible blurred boundary between the two. I should also say that Michael is deeply connected to Oxford, having been a Rhodes Scholar some time ago, and most recently, currently a valuable member of the Global Leadership Council of Saïd Business School as well. So I will interview Michael for the first 35 minutes or so, and then turn it over to you and everybody else who is able to join here synchronously to pose questions. If you could actually pose questions as we go along as well, through whatever means you're joining, very happy to try and weave them in as we move on to different topics around the boundary between business and government. So, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today. And I wondered if I could start by just asking you to say a little bit about your current operation, ASG in particular. I know that some of our MBA students have gone on to work for the company. So I have some sense of what it does, but in terms of the kind of issues that you deal with, the geographies that you actually have presence in, and also the work that you do in really promoting the interface between government and business.
Well, certainly. Well, thank you, Mari. And first, I just want to impart how honored I am to be part of this discussion with all of you today. And thank you and Dean Tufano for these webinars and everyone who's put them together. Dean Tufano is a truly global leader, an incredible dean, and we're all lucky to have his leadership at our Saïd Business School, especially during this time. Peter's positioned the school, its current class and our alumni to perhaps play one of the most important leadership roles in business and society that we have seen, given the fact that we will eventually recover from, in Peter's words, a public health, business, and humanitarian crisis. That crisis can only be solved with the leadership of people who are on this webinar. To paraphrase our chairman of the business school, Paul Pullman, of the business board, responsible capitalism, which seeks to move corporate culture beyond shareholder primacy, now faces its biggest test yet. And so that's what we will address today. I will try to keep my remarks brief so we can get into a conversation together. As far as what ASG does, ASG is a strategic advisory firm. It operates at the intersection of the private sector, the public sector, and social sectors. Now, for almost 20 years, we've worked with the world's leading companies, financial firms, foundations, and venture companies in tackling some of the world's toughest problems, which are often systemic in nature. We are a global company. We have worked in 110 countries, and in some senses are built for times like this, where you see the intersection between the private sector, public sector, and social sector actors being necessary in order to solve a problem. As commercial diplomats, and I underscore commercial in that, we built a firm with people like Madeleine Albright and Carlos Gutierrez, both U.S. cabinet secretaries. And we built a global network of other leaders operating at that intersection as well. Many former finance ministers like Sweden's Per Nuder, sector experts like Dr. Ashish Jha, who heads Harvard's Global Public Health Initiative, are people who are part of our team. Types of engagements that we have worked on range from early on helping a leading automobile manufacturer to make a company bet to locate their international operations in China versus India. We were working closely with organizations like CEPI now to tap into global resources for vaccine development all over the world. We have worked with a leading water and sanitation nonprofit to help them roll out micro lending programs which have resulted in providing access to clean water and sanitation to over 10 million people. We've worked with one of the largest tech companies in the world to implement a partnership to channel investments in carbon neutral and carbon negative technologies and remove its carbon footprint in 10 years. We have helped a consortium of private banks to enable partnerships in the development finance community and to establish a common policy on leveraging financial assets for positive climate impact. We've helped repatriate $20 billion in assets in Argentina that had been held for over a decade, which has significantly helped spur needed foreign direct investment. And meanwhile, we've just done the blocking and tackling and helping hundreds of firms grow globally and doing it the right way by being value-added citizens both locally and globally.
Right.
So that's a bit of what ASG does, and we do that as problem solvers, and that means just getting the right answer and one that will last over a period of time.
Right. Well, you've taken us to different parts of the world, and that reflects the locations from which people are listening to you, from London, South Africa, Malaysia, Spain, US, of course, Germany, South Africa again, Sierra Leone, Egypt, Italy, and Jakarta. I'd like to perhaps move into right into the main topic of today, which is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and the role of government around that too. So I think sitting in the UK, what we see is very much a government that's imposed the lockdown, of course, but have really been, nationalizing passenger railway network, also spending more money to support the employment relationships through this so-called furlough scheme, and also credit to businesses in particular, small businesses as well. And I wanted to, what extent the kind of actions that governments are taking right now looking at it from the DC perspective, but different parts of the world that you operate, some of those elements which may stay here to stay for some time to come, as opposed to something that could be a crisis emergency reaction that may be temporary. What is your perspective on what is the government doing right now and its legacies beyond the crisis?
Oh, thank you, Mari. Well, for the first time, perhaps since World War II, we are seeing a real economy shock that is moving through not only the real economy, but through the financial sector. Usually, the crises we've encountered have been financial in nature and have impacted to various extents the real economy. Because of this, governments have had to step in a significant way across the world to prop up the real economy to the degree that it can. And so it's, as Tufano would call it, government capitalism. The balance sheets are now ones where the government now owns a lot of the real economy's balance sheets. And one of the central policy questions is who's going to pay the bill over time, and how does that all manifest itself? Clearly, governments and business and many social sector actors are working together more collaboratively than they've done in quite a while. You have many companies now, and you gave some terrific examples, Mari. Many companies now who are retooling their manufacturing processes to make more PPE for front lines. People who are giving over parts of their business to make sure that we can really deal with the pandemic. We're going to see more and more of that, particularly as we go through not only this first wave, but what we think could very well be another wave of this pandemic in the fall. But those traditional lines have been very much blurred, and how we come out of it will be a function of the types of governments that each country has put in place and how each parts of these sectors work with each other. And we've seen when there is real understanding and, to the degree you can, coordination between the three sectors, that has been the most effective way to be able to not only deal with the near-term complications of this pandemic, but will likely be the best path for recovery.
Yeah. So since the pandemic is a global health crisis, I wonder if you could comment on some of the different ways in which different governments have reacted to the pandemic. And I mean, it is quite astounding that the variation in the kinds of reactions that governments have put in place don't seem to have any easy patterns around whether democracies or not, or whether they have great resources or not. On the one hand, you have governments like South Korea and New Zealand really acting fast and in a very forthright way for whatever reason. And on the other, some very egregious examples of autocrats, in Hungary or El Salvador, just to name a few countries, that seem to be using the pandemic as an excuse for increasing control over their citizens as well. And, what are some of the kind of important patterns that you think we're seeing in these differences that you think are important in approaching lockdown versus, so isolation and testing on the other hand? And the kinds of results that they're having, not so much kind of ranking and assessing the death rates, but in terms of the government responses from the experience that you have advising different governments in different parts of the world. What are the important patterns that you're seeing here? Are there any? If I don't see a very simplistic pattern, so I'm just kind of wondering whether you kind of can enlighten us in that respect a little.
Well, you touched on a number of important points in the question, Mari. What we've seen is the response to the crisis is reflective of each country's governance structure. China certainly approached this from a very top-down manner, and with Xi really imposing restrictions. The U.S., with its constant tension between central government and the states, has adopted a much more hands-off approach, and governors are more prominent and more in the leadership role than ever, and quite a long time. I should say, quite a long time. The White House is much less. Other countries have been somewhere in the middle, and as you said, this is all complemented by the two types of approaches that governments are taking to the crisis in terms of the pandemic itself, whether it's aggressive testing, tracing and isolation, or more of a lockdown approach. And you touched on South Korea, which is, they had an early spike in February, and had at that time the second highest amount of cases behind China, but it really implemented a much more aggressive strategy that saw mass testing and the use of technology to trace the steps of potentially infected individuals, right? On the other end, you see a lockdown approach in India, the US, and other countries in Europe. And that has had, in the US in particular, has had very inconsistent levels of followership, and has almost been politicized. Now there's still an open debate in many states about whether to use masks at all. And certainly the President of the United States has decided not to. There are other places like Germany, which have walked the line between testing and tracing, and they've had a really high degree of success. They proactively augmented the number of ICU beds, developed pretty rapid testing, which they were performing up to 1 million diagnostic tests per day really early on. And it has been relatively lower than other Western European countries. And as you mentioned, New Zealand has quickly implemented a national lockdown alongside aggressive testing, and as a result, they've begun easing restrictions and really have a very few number of recorded active cases. I think it's around 20 or so. So those are the different ways that each of the governments have responded, and what will be telling will be how the governments will get people back to reopen the economies, right? Because there's a central tension here, as we all know, that the longer that particularly in lockdown places, the economy is shut down, the more unemployment and perhaps permanent damage happens to many businesses and many institutions.
Yeah, no, maybe a good segue into thinking about the near-term future is to kind of consider the government's finances. So, what appears to be common is that all governments are definitely spending a lot more on various things to do with propping up businesses or making sure that people keep their jobs for now. And then, of course, the public health spending that's likely to go up as well. Or already have gone up. So there's actually an interesting question that's come through from the audience asking, are we going to see a significant increase in tax rates in all countries to pay back governments and the cost to bail out businesses and workers? And how is that going to get dealt with? Are we going to get all governments have higher debt, much longer term financial difficulties? Around the ways in which they have to manage their bonds and their finances?
Oh, that's a terrific question, and certainly raising taxes is going to be one way that many, if not most, governments will look to try to deleverage the balance sheets of both the private sector and the public sector. It will depend on the politics of each country and who's in charge. In the U.S., typically, it will be typically, if a Democrat's in charge, there will likely be different types of taxes raised than if a Republican is in charge, typically. But certainly taxes it has to be a part of the solution. It's a question of which taxes and how they're applied. In sticking with the U.S., the Federal Reserve has been very clear that they will continue to provide fiscal stimulus for as long as it will take for a vaccine to be both discovered and to be able to have it produced at a level that gets to herd immunity. And so that could be quite a while. It could be into the end of 2021, as many people think, or even into 2022. But Mari, as you had indicated, a lot of it will have to do with the financial health of the countries themselves. And as we all know, when you start to spend money like that, you have other effects that will take place. So there could be certainly inflation in some places. There could be a number of economic effects, but yes, taxes will be a very central part of the conversation going forward.
Yeah, I know that you also operate in the emerging markets. I wondered to what extent your perspective would be, somewhat different in countries where obviously there's a lot more issues around poverty, issues around income distribution, issues around food security as well. What would be the role of governments in those parts? Again, it's difficult to generalize, but happy to kind of get you to perhaps reflect on one or two countries that you're familiar with where you've actually done some advisory work.
Well, in many of the emerging, in the smaller countries, I should just say, the dynamics are different than in, say, the US or Europe. In Latin America, small and medium businesses provide about 50% of formal employment. The small and medium businesses are going to be hit especially hard during this pandemic, and that's the case throughout many of the smaller countries that they don't have the Googles or the Walmarts or Tesco's of the world, and so that's going to take a very, very different path. It's still early too. We're seeing clearly a spike in Latin America, but start to see spikes in Africa and in other small economies that are smaller, and the effects could be quite drastic, particularly because of social distancing in some places being extremely hard to enact. Already, and not to just bring it back to the U.S., but already, if the U.S. is any indication, in 6 weeks, the U.S. lost 30 million jobs. The U.S. created created 22.4 million jobs in the 11 years prior. So in 6 weeks, we not only erased all the jobs that we created 11 years prior, but significantly lost more. If that dynamic is is a measure, it's going to be extremely difficult for many of the emerging market countries. And the real question is going to be around who else will help with those balance sheets, right? Will there be a number of central banks that come together and help? Will the World Bank help? Those are going to be some questions that we'll start to really see over this next period.
Yeah, no, I think the impact of dislocation of the lockdown on countries with very large populations like India has been severe. And so there's a question coming in from Sudan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Sudadra in India, who's asking, could you reflect on comparing the responses of China and India, which each have population over 1 billion? So I guess this is a question about not just the financial aspect, but just evaluating on the government responses to COVID. more
So,
generally?
no, that's a great question. China really both countries have very strong leaders, and both countries really did try to move pretty quickly to address the pandemic. Clearly there's a difference in the governance structure, where India is much democratic and China is much more top down. So what we've seen in China has been a very straightforward lockdown, and we're getting the best data we can, but they've seen some results. But India has not yet been hit as hard as China was, and that's only because we're in the early days, and the government has taken a real proactive stance. How this will be implemented, particularly in China, is still to be seen. And it's important to note that we're really, in the halfway through the first half of this pandemic at best. If everything goes well, we'll be able to round out of this by 2021, by the end of 2021, but we could be very well into 2022 or longer. Really, more than anything, what we're seeing is that China has reached out. India has reached out quite a bit to try to figure out what best practices are. China has its very clear plan.
Yeah, I wonder if I could switch gear a little bit to ask you about the kind of global health issue as a systemic issue that both governments and private sector could work together. Drawing lessons from what's happened to the reactions in this pandemic, what are you envisaging would be a different sort of coordination that could happen across different governments through the WHO or through other mechanisms that could be much more effective? How can we really increase the effectiveness of managing global health from a kind of international global perspective to put it in terms of economic kind of global public goods? How can we really promote this global good in a much better way than we have been doing right now? Are there any thoughts around that from your perspective?
Well, we're spending a lot of time at ASG on this. We have a global public health practice, which has some of the leading global public health practitioners associated with it, mental health practitioners associated with it, and those who are really engaged in the science of global public health, including COVID. And we're working quite closely with CEPI, which has this strong relationship with the WHO to help bring capital together to be able to fund vaccine research, and that has helped both public sector and private sector actors find new ways. We are seeing a collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and between countries that we haven't seen in a very long time. And in fact, as it relates to the push for a vaccine itself, we've not seen this many people focused on figuring out an effective vaccine and perhaps ever. There's data that is widely shared. They now understand the genome of the virus, which has been a global collaboration. And so we're going to see more and more of this, but it's, again, early days in terms of exactly how. But some of the major foundations, whether it's the Gates Foundation, which has played a very, very strong role in this, and who we also work extremely closely with, or CEPI, or some of the WHO, they're all going to increasingly play a large role. And I do know that governments are actually actively figuring out how not only just to help them in their efforts, but really spur the private sector to push forward with the innovations that are going to be necessary to help solve this crisis as well.
Right. And so is there a remaining role for WHO as it stands, which again has become a little bit politicized, unfortunately, in my view, but what would you think would be their future role? I know that they've agreed to review and the origins of the virus, and in China it appears to have acquiesced to that and all that. But beyond it, where should WHO go in relation to national governments? It is a tricky question, maybe, but what are at least your speculation about where it might be taken?
The WHO, the World Bank, these institutions that were there to try to work across countries are going to take their fair share of criticism, but they are going to continue to try to play the role that they've always played in trying to tackle systemic issues, right? And they've been and they're still going to facilitate information. CEPI is a large part of that, and so since we work with them closely, we know that's the case. And look, already the global coordination around trying to get to a vaccine, which is really going to be the hallmark of us being able to make the transition back to normal life, is already seeing pretty good progress. There's, as I mentioned, there's good evidence that we have a good immune response, as opposed to, say, HIV, where we still don't have that type of response. There are now 100 vaccines that are being developed in 10 to 14 clinical trials. All that information is being shared as much as possible. Certainly, the information that people know about, they're using to try to take the next step. Some of those vaccines are being developed in the US, some are in Europe, some in China. China might be ahead of everyone now. And so that coordination will still continue and it'll be fundamentally necessary to be able to combat, which is clearly going to be a second wave, which could be even worse than the one we're in right now.
Right. I'd like to sort of pose a couple of more questions to close this part, to kind of get more questions from the audience. But first is kind of looking into the future. In a way, everybody's doing scenario planning and thinking about possible futures and trying to better prepare for those scenarios if they came into reality. But from your normative standpoint, in this seminar series is partly about, thinking about, what kind of world we want to create, as much as preparing for something that could happen and be imposed upon you. What are your perspective on what's to come in terms of the sort of world you'd like to see as a result of coming out of the pandemic? The role of government, role of business, society at large. What's the kind of shape of society at large, both at the world level, country level, and maybe also at the subnational, municipal level? What are some of the important factors that you think are worthwhile really advocating?
Well, that's a very, very good question. We're going to need to see, we're already starting to see it some, but we're going to need to see a world that is much more coordinated at the intersection of the private sector, public sector, and social sector. There's an increasing understanding that those sectors can operate on their own and independently for a long period of time, and that certainly the tail risks that we're experiencing now and we will continue to experience are not ones that any one sector can fundamentally address right now. And so what we're seeing is a number of both countries and localities trying to work together to see how we can recover together, right? And that's still very early days, but those conversations are happening. We're seeing presidents call governors in the United States. We're seeing private sector actors having more and more of an audience with governments and vice versa. A lot of basic research is being talked about again and being funded because that's really, we're in the middle of needing to do that for the vaccine. But the sharing of technology is happening a little bit more than it had before. And as you know, that the race towards AI and 5G has been one where there's been an east-west tension over standards. That's still there, but the overall sharing of technology advances have been necessary in order to solve for this crisis. I see a world where we're going to see a lot more coordination and a lot more collaboration. And if we don't, it will be at the country and the world's peril.
Right. So, I mean, just touching on one aspect of what you said about globalization, that some, academics and others, critics of globalization, say that it's gone too far in some way, that the degree of integration of at least the economy, if not other aspects of society, have gone too far. And so some people are looking post-pandemic to a much more autonomous, national and subnational economies where food security and issues of business and wealth creation are going to be dealt with at a much local level. Is that something that could figure consistently with the worldview that you had of greater coordination at the global level?
Yes, and perhaps it's helpful to frame like where we are in terms of the issues. I mean, the world was geopolitical access for power for governments and for companies, financial institutions really revolved around oil and defense for a very long time. Oil has been supplemented with scarce resources, water, climate, sustainability, and globalization was a large part of defense was still, and it still is, a very important driver, but globalization was really a driver. This next phase, we're seeing that both global public health and inequality are going to be issues that everyone's going to need to address. And those issues are ones that will fundamentally affect the path out of what we're in. And so, yes, I very much see a need for far more coordination. And coordination that means more that there's partnerships and working together, being able to understand that you're solving a larger problem than just making your quarterly numbers if you're in the private sector, even though that's still going to be critically important. It's taking on that shared risk, just as the balance sheets are going to have to delever both for governments and for the private sector. The risk sharing is also going to have to be far more coordinated.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to seamlessly morph into fielding some questions from the audience, and perhaps this is a good opportunity to also look at this issues from a business perspective as well. So George in the UK from Britain says that as business people, what steps can we proactively take to reignite business and take the fear away? I guess what kind of mindset and skills and capabilities should business leaders be, considering now so that they could promote and contribute to reigniting the economy?
Well, as I think about this, there are a few ways. One way is to communicate with authenticity and transparency as a business leader with your employees and other stakeholders. And being honest about what you know and what you don't know. That's going to be critical to establish trust now, but always want to project strength in a leadership role, but sometimes saying you don't know is stronger than saying you do when you really don't. Another is understanding the local and global stresses that your business will have. Supply chains, workforce, customers, shareholders, all will have a different set of needs and concerns, and being able to re-examine those and understand how to build them and make the right type of adjustments both during this period and after this period will be critical. And it's never more important for business to keep their ear to the ground and really make sure that it's not to break the processes that are in place now, but to really keep the ear to the ground for how best to navigate through these new risks and global stresses.
Right.
The third, and perhaps really important, is asking not what government can do for you, but what you can do for government and social sector partners and stakeholders. When I was in the White House, I was the point person to staff the economic team for President Obama, and I was also deployed to really understand what was happening in Treasury and Federal Reserve during the transition period during the financial crisis. And sitting in those seats, many business leaders came to me asking me to fix their problems. The ones that we really were able to help the most were the ones that really were really helpful to us. It enabled us to be more helpful to them. So and there's a lot for you to be able to offer. Accelerate your long-term strategic plans. This is a moment for any business to seize a white space an uncertainty space that has now been created. So be bold if you have conviction in strategy. Certainly check it and make sure that it's still viable. But if it is and you have conviction, be bold. And this is where companies earn separation. I know we were able to do that during the last crisis, and I know we're trying to do that now. And if you want to create distinctive long-term shareholder value, you can earn this by being truly compassionate, empathetic, and mission-oriented. Actions do speak louder than words. The saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, only applies if you're trusted enough to solve for all the stakeholders involved and affected by this crisis and the aftermath. Being true, just exploitive of the crisis is a risky long-term strategy. So those are mindsets to be able for business leaders to think about.
No, that's really, really thoughtful, and in a way it's easier said than done, but it appears like you're talking about a mindset and that kind of framework for thinking as much as concrete actions that might result from it. But nevertheless, I have a question from an ex-student on the Diploma in Global Business, Lola, hello, talking about globalization again, and whether it's under attack and supply chain starts inward-looking and governments inject more money into their own economies and not opening borders. So in that context, what is it that businesses should be doing? Should they provide more buffers into the supply chain, or how are we going to think about this issue in the planning horizon, short term and long term as well?
It's a terrific question. It's in a nutshell, there's going to need to be both local supply chains that are built and shorn up, but also a real attention to the global supply chains that are going to be necessary for businesses to grow. Simply turning inward only makes the addressable market much smaller, and over the long term, the lack of investment in those global supply chains will have a negative effect on the business. But at the same time, only focusing on global supply chains and not focusing on what's happening locally and really paying attention to the ways those supply chains are morphing and changing will cause equal destruction of value. So it's a much more complex operating environment now for business executives. And technology can help, but really spending time deconstructing the supply chain will be important. Most companies don't at this point really know what each of the steps are in their supply chains, right? The U.S. found very much that it didn't manufacture hardly any of the PPE that it needed to address the pandemic, and are now taking some very hard looks about how to establish some local supply chains, but at the same time, not fully retreating away from the dynamic that has been created through globalization.
Yeah. Maybe turning to government action again, but kind of different levels of responses at the kind of national and the regional level. There's a question about the current debates, at least in the developed economies like UK, US, and Germany, about whether or not it would have been better, but will be better if there is ever a second wave as well, to handle the virus at the national level or at the much lower kind of municipal or local level. Do you have a view on the best kind of response that could be crafted in preparation for possibly a second wave or a prolonged existence of the virus?
Well, if there are any lessons to be learned, not only from the first wave of COVID-19, but just from other pandemics, it is that coming out of lockdown too soon will exacerbate the time that it takes for these pandemics to fully pass through. We know that the virus will continue until about 50 to 80% of the world is infected. I mean, just the math of that says, if there's 7 billion people and even a 60% infection rate, that's over 4 billion people, and so that it's going to take a while for either the vaccine to be created and for people to be produced at a level that can immunize enough people, or we're going to have a really tough second wave, which fall could be really tough. And so, to answer the question, certainly having a coordinated response at the top has made things better. The hard part is that the politics around doing that in different places are different, right? And so I know in the U.S., New York is being held up as an example of what to do. So is California, but not every state is going to follow it. And what we might see is just spikes in places where the governments feel a need to get people back to work faster because of the destruction that's happening in their states. And I think we'll see that type of dynamic in other places in the world. But we're quickly starting to get to some best practices, and but it's still early.
Right. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions before I ask you to wrap up. And the first is very much about the impact of the COVID on enhancing inequalities. Those people who are marginalized in society are getting more marginalized as a result of the direct impact, because the virus is hitting minorities harder than others for pre-existing health or other reasons, as well as the fact that things like school closure means that those who are in more disadvantaged position are not being educated, as well as other households with a very long-term impact on that. So I wanted to ask you to reflect on the relative role of governments, but also maybe civil society as well as business in addressing that issue in the decades to come. How can we move forward on this?
This is going to be a critical issue in our times, right? And as you know, both this question and question prior touched on, globalization has really brought a lot of millions of people out of poverty, but it's also created some fissures that have caused significant income inequality, and we've seen the response to that, whether it's in protectionism across the world. Almost every pandemic exacerbates that crisis. You think it's an equalizer because it can affect everyone, but those with more means have more ways to lower the risk that they are affected. And this is where not only just governments, but business and the social sector, right? The foundations, the NGOs, the pseudo government and pseudo business entities that are emerging are going to have to play a critical role in getting people back to work, and figuring out how we can distance learn in a way that creates some degree of equality. And those are only for people who even have the internet. A lot of people don't. This is going to be an issue that will not go away, and we cannot look past. And this is where real leaders will take this on, both in a local way, which will be important, but also from a policy perspective, and a broader view, not only in the countries in which we live, but across the globe. And without doing that, the real economy will certainly shrink. There will be less consumers to be able to buy the goods and services that are produced, and we could be in for a long period of economic hardship, not only for those who don't have as much, but for those that do. Right.
And I'm going to just ask the one last question, which is back to business, actually, and kind of longer term planning around capital allocation with your expertise on that. It's from Matt McGrath asking, how should businesses think about managing working capital given the uncertainty around how long economic activity will be suppressed?
That's a great question. Being both large institutions and small ones now are in some part levered in a way that we have not seen in a long time. We had many balance sheets had significant cash holdings on them. That has evaporated in many cases, and more than's been reported, particularly in either smaller businesses or in private equity vehicles where you're not marking to market and you don't see the effects as quickly, or at least you're not reporting the effects as quickly. You're seeing the effects for certain in portfolio companies, with their sales drying up, but not being reported. And so working capital is going to be ever more important to be able to take a much longer term view. And there, getting the sources and uses, we'll have to think about differently, right? The banks are in a much better place to lend than they were during the financial crisis, due to Basel III and many of the regulations that have helped banks keep more capital on the balance sheet and not get in businesses where they had systemic risk within the banks themselves. But nonetheless, their underwriting standards are going to increase, and they're going to feel much less comfortable lending. So thinking about this being thinking about the condition we're in now being the case through the end of 2021 at least, should help companies think about what capital allocation they can afford, and to prepare for it to go through 2022. So it also is going to mean that you think about your business model a little differently, about how you're going to realize revenue a little bit differently, and then who your capital partners are. there's still significant liquidity in the markets. A lot of people are sitting on cash, and finding ways to get to that cash and create new partnerships are going to be critical for managing through this period from a working capital and business management perspective.
Great, thank you, Michael. And so the time's nearly up, but I just wanted to make sure that you covered all the grounds that you wanted to cover in terms of the boundary between business and government, and maybe give you an opportunity, a couple of minutes, to kind of really highlight the key messages that you want to get across to people who are able to join us.
Fundamentally, we've encountered a situation that most of us haven't seen in our lifetime in terms of the impact of this pandemic on the real economy and what it has done in such a rapid manner to the global economy and the disruption to people's lives. Virtually everybody is, even if you worked from home before, not your clients all didn't, or your other relationships all didn't, and we're now in an uncharted territory around this. Everyone on this listening into this, the vast majority of you have a real opportunity to lead now. And Oxford Saïd School has been teaching how to think about times like this, and is perfectly positioned for the leaders to come from Saïd. As I said at the beginning, Dean Tufano has done a terrific job of positioning Oxford for leadership in business and society. And business and society right now will be the only way we will navigate our way through this this period right now. This pandemic will not be the last. There's significant increasing evidence that with climate change in particular, there are other global health issues that are going to continue to rear their heads over the next decade or two, and really being able to, as I had referred a little bit earlier, being able to have the skills to be able to communicate effectively, to have empathy, to be data driven, and really understand the science not only of pandemics, but even of the businesses that you operate, and having a firm grasp in leveraging technology, which is going to increasingly dictate the winners and losers coming out of this, and being able to deal with ambiguity and risk and be decisive in those periods are going to be the traits that where not only leaders will be distinctive, but where you will have the most impact in the world. And I believe that Oxford has equipped its students and its alumni with the ability to do that as well as any school in the world. And now is the time to really use those tools and the community that we have to really change the world. And finally, I'll just say, make sure you spend time finding 3 or 4 other people who you can feel you can work with to really solve the problems that you have and be able to help others. Because this is a moment where the collective is going to go far further than the individual.
Thank you, Michael, on that really uplifting and incredibly important message that we want to convey from the school as well. So I'd like to thank everybody who has contributed today and watched us today. I know that there's some other questions that we had no time to address around, nationalistic trend, the protectionist fear, the control and surveillance capitalism that might be around, lurking around, and all that kind of issues which are to do with government action. Thank you. A special thank you to you, Michael, for sharing your really valuable insight based on your expertise and experience. And I do hope that we can ask you to contribute on a continuing basis to give us words of wisdom as the school thinks about its future and what kind of education we should be providing as well. And last and not least, I just want to say that there will be a continued series on this. So next Tuesday, our next session on this Leading in Extraordinary Times series, my colleague Mary Johnson-Lewis, who is the program director for the Ownership Project at Oxford, and our Dean Peter Tufano will be joined by Andrea Hoffman, who's the vice chair of Hoffman La Roche, to speak about the role of pharmaceutical industry in the COVID pandemic, the broader role of business in society, and the special role that family farms can play in addressing the critical challenges of the world. So I hope that you can all join us for that and the subsequent sessions that we'll be organizing throughout the month of June as well. But for now, thank you so much, everybody. And also special thanks again to Michael. Thank you for really joining us to share your words of wisdom.
Oh, it's been my honor. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye for now.